one of the biggest advantages big corporates have over smaller competitors is larger budgets to reinforce their brands. However, technology is changing the landscape, and entrepreneurs who think out of the box can outsmart their competitors. We take a look at how entrepreneurs are able to market their businesses on a shoestring and come out ahead. Still in studio with me, I have Marc, Ashton, Finweek editor, Jessica Hubbard, Finweek journalist, and joining us now, Musa, Kalenga, head of digital marketing at Nedbank, and Britten, strategic partner at SOAP. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Of course, we've traditionally had the picture, big market equals big share of voice equals big market share. Is that landscape changing, and why? And let me pose it to you, Sarah, first.
It's changing quite radically, and one of the clients I work with is the Lurie Awards, and it's interesting to see what campaigns are being entered year on year. This is the first year that digital entries have passed 300. So we can see that digital is in fact coming out quite a lot. And it's a great leveler because the barrier to entry is so much lower and the power of ideas is so much more relevant. You can buy media space and you can do a bad ad, but if you do a bad ad in digital and it's not memorable, it's not differentiated, people aren't going to pay attention to you. So that's shifted the balance of power in interesting ways. It's the power of ideas, the power of coming up with something that people want, and also the power of relationships. I think that's something we should talk about as we go on, is that social media offers entrepreneurs a way to build relationships with key influencers and sort of turn them into brand advocates.
Are we seeing an upcrop of brand advocates that Sarah speaks about, Musa, especially if we zoom in on digital media and the number of platforms that are currently available right now to tap into?
Yes, most definitely. I think the one thing about social media that is very differentiated is the ability to generate conversations around narratives and around pieces of information that people find interesting. So as a direct result, we're seeing in South Africa a lot of thought leaders that are coming through the fray, and they're starting to build content around what is important to them, and small businesses like to consume content because they have to get stuff done quite cheaply, and they have to get stuff done in a way that is accessible quickly, and that they can use on a day-to-day basis. So I think a lot of thought leaders are creeping up as a result of this. They're creating content that's specific to different niches and audiences, and I think entrepreneurs are consuming it quite a lot.
So I want to throw Sarah quickly. So I mean, this whole social media thing is quite interesting in that how people have changed. Suddenly social media gave everybody a voice. You could buy your followers on Twitter, you could buy Facebook fans, etc., etc. And you could kind of dummy up a brand for a little bit, but people very quickly started to see through it. One of the trends that does seem to be coming through, though, is this whole aspect of being able to tell a story through social media. And just before I came through here, I watched a Hunsa advert. Now, Hunsa has used the whole voyo entrepreneur field to be able to, here's my market, I'm able to hit it. They're starting to tell the story of young entrepreneurs coming through in it's primarily a digital campaign. You've seen the TV ads, it gets shared on social media. It's that storytelling aspect that seems to really be gaining traction. And you know, you look at Coronation, Hunsa, Amstel, they've all been able to tell, it's a storytelling aspect rather than just using social media as a soapbox.
Exactly, and I think Musa made a very good point about content and narrative. And I'd also like to raise a point about likability. I've noticed an interesting trend where brands are trying to behave more like people rather than people trying to be like brands. There's this debate over personal branding and how you create your brand. But we tend to do business with people that we like. And the best way to get liked is to get known, and the best way to get known is to be out there talking to people, connecting with them, possibly seeding your product out there, giving your product to somebody who's interested in what you do. Influencer marketing is a very big, well, it's small right now, but it's actually growing quite a lot. So that's one way, is to get people to talk about you, give them your product, give them what you do.
Just to go back to the point that you make about influencer marketing right now, so I mean, has technology changed who the thought leader is? Are we seeing those power dynamics in terms of who has the authority of voice? Is that changing in itself? Or are we still finding that corporates, or big or small, are still to the large extent the formulators of the narrative that we speak about?
So many research studies are showing that we tend to treat information from people like us with greater credibility than advertising or any other form of communication. So word of mouth has become more important. We tend to build relationships with bloggers and we trust them, although that raises a whole interesting question about bloggers getting paid to write about products and services, and there's a lot of politics in the blogosphere and on Twitter, where that sense of credibility, you're getting somebody's unvarnished opinion, is now being questioned. So brands are having to adapt, and people like me are having to adapt, because I'm the person advising brands on how to deal with this, and clients on how to deal with this. So it's shifting so rapidly, it's actually quite hard to keep up sometimes.
I think it's actually presenting quite a difficult situation for companies, because some of their lower level employees who traditionally in the olden days wouldn't have had any access with the media, they're now using social media to speak to crowds that they're building up, into circles that they're creating. And when those messages have something to do with the company they work for and aren't necessarily flattering, that's a dangerous situation for companies which they haven't really yet worked out how to deal with.
I think to a large extent as well, and I maybe I'll pose this to you, Musa. I mean, we're talking about a question of credibility right now that seems to be coming up as one of the thematic areas. And oftentimes, though, when we look at the pitfalls of these social media platforms, it's usually almost at a personal level. Now, what are the pitfalls that a business that has decided to go the social media route in light of a relatively smaller budget should be looking out for before they latch onto that platform? Sometimes
I think brands just overthink it, because I think social media fundamentally hasn't changed what we do as human beings. So the way we communicate and the way we pass information from one person to another, it will never change. What social media does is just, it amplifies that, and it provides you a set of tools to be able to do that on a broader scale. So I think some of the pitfalls that brands typically display is that when they start getting involved in conversations, number one, they don't listen to what's going on. So I always use the analogy: if you found a bunch of people sitting at a bar having a conversation about sport, you wouldn't go there and start talking about quantum physics, because it just doesn't make sense. So to listen to the conversations that are happening is very important, because once you start listening, you can actually start contributing, and that's where the value is. So I think that's the first thing brands do wrong. The second thing is they try and impose product as opposed to try and add value through conversation. So the same analogy: I'm sitting there and I'm having a conversation with friends, and all of a sudden you're telling me about Hansa or a check account, and it's very random, because that's not how humans communicate. So I think those fundamental things make it very difficult for people to look at it and feel that this person or this brand is being authentic, and that's where we get a lot of pushback from consumers that are becoming more smart.
What about integrity and focus? So this is something I find very interesting, is a lot of the social media actually gets managed by a whole lot of different individuals, and different personalities naturally find their way through. And we've all, the Kit Kat stories and that kind of thing that have been in the past, where it's been outsourced to some junior who suddenly decides, I'm going to go totally out on a limb. How much is it about reinforcing specific brand values and integrity? You've got to repeat the same message. You've got to be able to say, this is what I believe, and this is how I represent through my brand, through my social media channels.
So I think it's an adaptation of thinking, and I think the concept of the brand being responsible for the narrative is important. I don't think a brand can take its values, cut and paste them into the environment and hope for this wonderful uptake. But what I do think brands do control is the ability to create narrative and stories, which humans can then take, personalize and amplify. I think one of the biggest mistakes, as you've mentioned, is sticking to your brand guide and sticking to your brand personality and saying, Nedbank stands for this and this is what we do, going onto social media and just punting all of that. That's where people turn around and they think it's... But if we create narrative around the principle of making things happen, that narrative can be taken by human beings and they can bring that to life.
Just a quick question for Sarah. If I'm an entrepreneur and I want to get my business out there, do I start by building a story around me, the entrepreneur, myself, Jessica, or do I build it around the product I'm selling, the business that I'm founding? Or where do you begin?
I think you begin by looking at the category that your product is in and what the drivers are. Why would people want your product? Is there a lot of trust that's required? If there is, then you need to position yourself as a thought leader. You need to be putting out a lot of content that's useful. I often do social media talks for financial planners. Now that's a very high trust industry and often perceived to be a little bit dodgy. I'm not sure, you just want to sell me something. So how do you build a relationship with somebody and trust their judgment and start to get to a point where they'll want to give you money? For other things, like for cosmetics or sweets or a restaurant, then your approach would be slightly different, because you want to bring people to a physical place, or you want to get them to go to a store and buy your product. Often it does help to be a brand ambassador for your own brand, because we build relationships with people, not with brands. The danger, of course, is if you get so invested in your own brand that if you're not able to promote it, the brand dies without you. So the brand, to an extent, does have to be bigger than you.
So, I mean, that's an interesting one, because we know the Loction culture story was, you've got no marketing money, but I want to get an ambassador to take my brand. How do I connect myself up with somebody who has a bit of clout in the social media space to say, here, I've got a product. How do I get it to endorse it without it being an endorsement if you get the application? That's
an interesting one, and you've got to start by following the conversation. Twitter is the best place to start to see what people talk about, what they're interested in. So you look for what people care about and talk about anyway. So don't go to somebody who never talks about the product you're selling and expect them to suddenly start punting it, because it will erode their credibility and it won't make you look good. So find what people care about anyway, connect with them, tell them your story, get them to like you, take them for coffee. Some influencers are so big and so in demand that you would have to pay them, and you don't really want to pay somebody to promote your product. You don't want to go into that space. But if you give somebody something nice with a nice story that goes with it, most influencers will tweet a picture of it at the very least and will work with you and be nice to you. So it's about making friends.
Is there a risk, though, of, especially when we look at the Twitter platform, of people almost taking away ownership or eroding the ownership that you have over your brand? As there's, I mean, it would be great to think that you would always have to go to someone and ask them, you know, would you mind being a brand ambassador? But what if a character that you otherwise would not want to be associated with decides, you know, that they actually have some sort of attraction to this brand and then begin punting it? You don't really have the control of how do you respond to that, and how do you take your brand back?
Shall I give that a bash?
I'll let you take that one.
So I think communities tend to self-regulate, and people within communities tend to understand the rules of engagement. So if you've got a rogue character that is damaging the brand or doing things that are outside of kind of the unwritten rules, what generally happens, if you've built a strong community and they understand the narrative, they tend to self-regulate, and people will kind of start to crowd the conversation out or direct it in a different direction. We saw that happening during the bank wars between Standard Bank and FNB. FNB actually didn't say anything in the entire conversation. The whole community stood behind the brand. So although there was kind of a point of contention and there was challenges with what was being said, the brand itself actually didn't have to pipe up and say a thing. It was all done by the community who understood the brand and actually defended it. So they create advocates and they tend to self-regulate.
But I mean, that's an the bank was interesting. Obviously, you've got two high-profile brands. You know, they can afford to take out full-page ads in the paper. How do you guys, obviously, you guys being Nedbank, have got a lot of a small business focus at the moment. You've got a lot of entrepreneurs saying, I want to get my brand out there. But what happens if they don't have anything that's particularly unique?
Right.
How do they suddenly get themselves positioned? And I know it's a bit of a chicken and egg, because if you don't have something unique, how are you going to thrive as an entrepreneur? But they come to you with I sell a glass of water. How do I position myself, and how are you guys advising them to be able to be good at what it is that they do? Sure.
So we've created, I mean, from an ownership perspective, there's the media that you can own, and there's media that you don't own. We've created a platform for small businesses that allows them to, number one, get themselves registered in an environment that's got other like-minded entrepreneurs. Number two, we almost take them through a step-by-step process of optimizing how they use social media for their business. So we give them the tool, and through the tool we start to coach them on being able to get maximum value for it. So if businesses come in there and you're a plumber and you've never traditionally known how to reach out to other individuals, we introduce you to technology like Foursquare. We introduce you to thinking outside of what you know. But we bring you into a community of like-minded people so that you can start to realize the value, but then we reinforce that with a tool that enables you to be able to deliver.
It seems to be a trend. I mean, maybe you can comment on this, Sarah, but companies, or just the big ones right now, are incorporating social media training as part of their sort of employee induction process. Is that something that small businesses should also be doing?
Yeah, I think this trend is not going away. It's not a fad. I still get people who think it's a fad, and I smile sweetly and move swiftly along. But it's better to learn how to use it now, because the sooner you get in, the more you start building relationships, the more you learn the social codes. Twitter in particular is an environment where it's very easy to make mistakes and to say the wrong thing and to irritate people. So if you march in there and you say, hey, please follow me back, people will hate you. And you know, if you make grammar mistakes and things like that, you'll soon learn. And it's like being the new kid at school. You have to get in there and you have to make friends and you've got to be humble. And the sooner you start doing that, and the more you learn how to navigate that strange world, the better and the more it'll pay off down the line for your business.
What happens if somebody spoofs your brand? Just because you're a new kid on the block and I was thinking A&N. What happens if somebody spoofs your brand?
My view is you should actually have a sense of humour about it. I don't know if you in banking agree, but A&N did exactly the wrong thing by attempting to stop it, because you can't stop it. And if you don't have a sense of humour, then people don't like you. And what you really want to do on social media, and why it's great to position yourself as human, you want to buy forgiveness in advance of making mistakes.
Yeah, I think sometimes brands draw unnecessary attention to themselves by trying to cover up. You know, we saw with the BP debacle and now with A&N. The more you try and cover up and the more you try and patch things up, that's when you have the community starting to respond. There's nothing wrong with putting up your head and saying we made a mistake and dealing with the repercussions. But brands generally try and cover it up, and that's, I think, a very knee-jerk reaction based on how things were always managed. The PR response is always, no, let's cover it up, let's make it pretty. With social media, with online and digital, you try and do that, it actually blows up in your face. So I think it's important for them to be honest and to be able to deal with the conversation or repercussions of honesty.
Honesty, and I think that's the cue. We'll leave it on. Thanks for your time, Musa Kalenga, Head of Digital Marketing at Nedbank, and Sarah Britten, Strategic Partner at SOAP. Next up, investing in offshore property. Over the last couple of weeks, Finweek has been looking at the offshore property markets, where there's a clear trend towards quality developed market assets. We assess the options and suggest how you can cash in on this trend. Now, Marc, very quickly, if you're going into offshore property, where are you going to get the highest return on your investment?
Okay, so Credit Suisse did a quick report. They put, well, it was quick for me to read, probably not so quick for them to put together. But they essentially identified two areas, US and German markets. Obviously, there's quite a lot of recovery happening in Germany in terms of industrial property. US is always just, it's a deep property market. Buyers always want to be able to have access to US property. So essentially what you've got is opportunities to get into the offshore property market. We heard earlier, offshore investors want to get their assets offshore. Property is a great one. It tends to keep pace with inflation, and there are a lot of tools out there. A couple of the listed entities now let you have access to it. You've got Entry Properties, Capital and Counties, there's Atterbury coming to the market shortly, and there's also a bunch of ETFs out there. So essentially what we said is the trend out there is getting access to offshore property, use the tools that are out there.
A little bit of hints and guesses at Africa possibly being one of the possible destinations. We had a quick chat, I think, last week, and we said, well, it's great, but not that great. What's your standpoint? Are there opportunities for property investments in Africa right now?
I mean, Africa's difficult because there's no liquidity for it. You can't, there are no tools to be able to access specific things. You can buy some of the big property funds that may manage malls, and again, I come back to Atterbury, they will list on the JSE just now. But they give you access to Ghana, Mauritius, etc. But there's just no depth there for you to be able to really trade the property assets.